Stanford University.
Hi, I'm Frank Weichold. I work for the Food and Drug Administration. I'm a director in the Office of Critical Path and Regulatory Science. I work for the Chief Scientist, which is one of the central offices at the agency. And I'm telling you today something about how the agency deals with the challenges that we have and how we use science to inform decision-making processes and regulation. I will also tell you that my views are my personal views and not to be construed to represent the FDA's views or policies, and that is just a requirement in terms of putting it in the right context because, as you can understand, I cannot make here today policy with you. I'm going to talk to you about some of the basic regulatory principles, some of the legal authorities, things like what are regulatory triggers, how do we deal with regulating products and not processes, how do we separate the responsibilities into different centers at the FDA, and how do we deal with challenges, what kind of approaches do we take. And then I will also lead you through some of the information in terms of what the agency has done in terms of managerial approaches to deal with the challenges, how to separate it into different programs, and what kind of opportunities we are building for collaborations and interactions, because we believe this is key to success. If you look back historically, it is that often tragedies drove the change in how we regulate things that are important for our health. If you think back of the origins in terms of regulation of food and drug, it was a fatal transmission of tetanus that actually implemented the Biologics Control Act in 1902. Around the 1900s, there were a number of food scandals that finally brought about the so-called poison squad in 1906. Which was allowed to take action in terms of regulating and controlling towards safety of food mainly. Contaminations and adulteration of products we find throughout history, and for example in 1938 a bad incident where sulfonamide was contaminated with antifreeze led to the Food and Drug and Cosmetic Act, which now gave the government the power to regulate products. In the 60s, you may remember, if you're old enough, that there was a lot of controversy and a big scandal around a drug in Europe called thalidomide. And in fact, many malformations were unfortunately happening in babies and newborns during the developmental phase. This was averted through the regulations that FDA had established, and as such certainly speaks to the importance of good regulations in food and drug. We all read the news and we hear about contaminations like the melamine contamination, heparin contamination, and challenges in drug compounding, which points you towards some of the issues that we have to discuss in terms of regulatory authorities and who has the ultimate say, comparing federal law with state law and who is doing what. So I believe that a sound regulation is critical to protect the public and to assure confidence in products that industry brings to the market. And we also need to recognize that if we have inefficient or marginally efficient products, we actually do harm as well, because the lack of efficiency and efficacy is a safety issue. So what does FDA actually do? Well, the mission is to protect and promote public health. How do we protect? We assure safety, effectiveness and security of human and veterinary drugs, vaccines, biological products, medical devices, food, cosmetics, and radiation-emitting devices. How do we promote health? We speed innovations that make new products available to consumers. We make them safer. We make them more affordable. We need to provide accurate science-based information to maximize product benefits and reduce risks. We also want to enhance preparedness by facilitating the development of a public health emergency and medical countermeasure network. And as you know, in the past few years, we also regulate tobacco products. So now that seems to be a lot. What is it actually that FDA does not regulate, and where are the challenges within? Well, we do not regulate medical or veterinary practice, services, or pricing. And you can imagine that poses some challenges to the regulatory process. We also do not regulate alcohol, consumer products unless it's a radiation-emitting device. We do not regulate illicit drugs. We do not regulate health insurance, meat, and poultry, except the drugs that are in residual form in such product. We do not regulate pesticides, restaurants, grocery stores, water, or advertising, except if advertising deals with drugs and medical devices. And we certainly do not regulate reproduction and breeding. Now, is still everything clear? It can be confusing. For that we have some legal authority, we have statutory authorities, we have regulations, we have guidelines, and we set policies. And of course, most importantly, we have to be consistent in our policy. The slide here shows you some of the major elements that form the foundation of our statutory authorities, and gives you some examples for the Code of Federal Regulations, or short CFR, that are applied to product regulation as FDA does it. And certainly when we talk about guidance documents, those documents are not necessarily law, they are not binding, but they make recommendations as to how and what is the best current opinion about how to proceed with a specific challenge and how to regulate a particular area or a particular product. Now, you would say, well, so far so good, but then the devil is in the detail. And my slide here makes reference to some of the differences that we have, for example, in regulation of human drugs and human biologics. And if you look through the different authorities, you find that even within biological products and drugs, and between the two, there are inconsistencies in terms of the regulatory and statutory authorities that FDA actually can use. Now, FDA does face many challenges. Certainly there is rapid scientific development and breakthrough technologies that result in the development of novel products, and there is uncertainty about how to understand its safety and effectiveness. There are things that happen in society. There are new and evolving public health threats. We need to build preparedness for that. And if you think about globalization and how we supply our life and our desires, we have challenges with a globalization of the market. And as you can imagine, US law doesn't reach necessarily into other countries. So what is critical to understand is that it is the responsibility of FDA to provide accurate and useful consumer information in an age of information overload. We have multiple sources and multiple opportunities to do so. When we talk about the globalization challenge, I just pointed some of the numbers here on the slide towards a steep increase in, for example, pharmaceutical imports. It has doubled over a relatively short period of time, and the trend is not changing. So if you think of that alone, you understand that there are scientific solutions and new solutions in general needed in order to address the challenge. This slide points out as an example how complex a simple thing like canned tuna fish or the supply chain for canned tuna, how complex this supply chain can look like. And this is just to show in different parts of the world where different procedures are carried out and how the product is processed. And finally, we get it onto the consumer tables in the US, and we need to be able to know that this product has been processed appropriately, that it comes from safe sources, and it doesn't pose a health risk to our population. The globalization also has the challenge that we face rapidly developing countries. Just as an example here, Shenzhen in China in the 1980s was basically like a village, and if you look now, it is a pulsating modern city, and you can imagine how infrastructure challenges and the change in logistics influences how the Food and Drug Administration deals with that. Now, there are some globalization statistics that I have put together here, and it's not so much to be 100% accurate on the actual numbers, but it gives you a ballpark figure, and if you look through the numbers, you understand that it's quite a challenge for an agency that is essentially limited by laws and authorities that restrict it to the US market. It is very challenging to deal with a global situation. There are over 150 countries that we import goods from. There are a multitude of importers, about 150,000 perhaps now. And there are hundred thousands of foreign facilities that produce things where we need to understand how this is done. That converts also in a challenge on our borders, where FDA is looking into the goods that are shipped into the country and making sure that it's actually truly in it what it says. So we get about 30 million shipments every year. So if you think about this, historically we have separated between domestic and foreign products. This distinction is today largely obsolete. Now, here's some more globalization statistics and challenges. 10 to 15% of all food consumed in the US is imported. About 50% of fresh fruit and 20% of fresh vegetables are imported. 80% of seafood eaten domestically is from outside of the US. Food imports increased 10% per year from about 2005 on, and it goes on. In the world of devices that we regulate, medical devices, there are at least 50% of all medical devices which are used in the US stem from other countries. The medical device import grew over 10% as well every year since 2005. And when we look specifically into drugs, well, there is at least 40% of the drugs in the US that comes from overseas. Now, when you think of what the drugs are made up with and what kind of substances go into the drugs, we have to face a challenge that is even more complex, because there's 80% of the substances that come from resources and sources that are very difficult to control and regulate from the US because they are foreign. Now, historically, if you look back, you may remember some of it. There were supply chain tragedies, which certainly reinforced the importance of FDA doing a reliable job. Contaminations, adulteration, and the results of it are illustrated here with some of the snips and clips from news media. And that's just to reiterate the fact that this has to be taken very seriously, and we cannot allow gaps in our work. Now, in order to address that, FDA is reaching out to build a global safety network. And in that context, we have a number of offices and locations throughout the world in order to facilitate that. Certainly a big challenge, because it's all driven from our US soil, and it requires very effective interactions with other agencies. Collaboration, again, is a key. If you just think about the number of inspections that FDA has conducted in collaboration or on its own since 2008, it has almost doubled, and it increases every year. Now, there are very important elements that we have to arrange also in terms of international relationships and politics. Politics has to form a basis under which countries can work together. There's at least 30 arrangements with foreign countries and the counterpart organizations that are in existence, regulatory agencies in other countries. We are conducting joint inspections, we harmonize, and we advance standards that we can use together in an international context. But we also expand into the area of training, and the FDA certainly takes a lot of challenge here and has significant responsibilities because many other countries appreciate what FDA has done in the past decades and would like to build on the experience and success of, or relative success, that FDA has had. So building capacity for regulatory science and regulatory functions in collaboration, again, is a critical element how FDA can meet its mission to protect and promote public health. So one of the examples that I have picked out here is a actually development of the past few years. It is giving you some facts about a counterfeit detection device. We call it CD3. It is low cost. It is a field device that can be used from, let's say, the boots on the ground. It's convenient and effective, and it can detect counterfeit and adulterated products. It uses UV and infrared light to detect changes in any of the packaging or the drugs itself, and it certainly reduces the risk of counterfeit products coming into the circulation, ideally very close to where they are brought into or attempted to be brought into circulation. So it's a deployable device. Now, if you go back historically, you remember about the around the turn of the century in 1900, where there were many scandals, particularly in food contamination and the food supply chain. And in order to protect the public, there were actually human that volunteered to try out food, and it was observed whether the people would get sick. And only a little bit more than 100 years later, we have relatively sophisticated devices who can help us to do our job with objective means, driven, again, by science and technology. Now, when we speak of regulation, it is not always clear to people who do not work at FDA and who do not deal with FDA that the Food and Drug Administration is not getting into action by a name or a technology. For example, a genetically modified organism does not trigger an FDA action. Neither does genetically engineered or transgenic or gene or genome editing is not a thing that FDA regulates directly. So techniques and technologies are not regulated. They are not regulatory triggers of the Federal Food, Drug and Cosmetic Act. So what is the regulatory trigger that induces FDA to take any action? What takes FDA responsibility for if it doesn't regulate a technology? Well, let's look specifically into drugs, and let me give you some of the specific definitions here. So what is a drug? A drug is an article that is recognized in the United States Pharmacopoeia, the official homeopathic pharmacopoeia of the United States, or the official national formulary, or any supplement to any of them, and articles intended to use in the diagnosis, the cure, the mitigation, the treatment, or the prevention of disease in man or other animals, and articles other than food intended to affect the structure or any function of the body of man or any other animals. And certainly articles that are intended for the use as a component in any of the articles specified in the above mentioned A, B, and C, if you want to make reference to the slides that I am using here to describe that. So, as you recognize, there are certainly challenges to regulate. How do we deal with product versus process? We regulate products. We do not regulate processes. So FDA technically has no impact or influence on the way that an article that we regulate is manufactured or where does it come from. However, we are very aware of the fact, and it makes a lot of sense if you think about it, that the manufacturing processes actually affects the safety, effectiveness, purity and potency of an article significantly. Now, historically, the jargon would say in biological medical products, the process is the product, because the characterization of a biologic, particularly in history, was so complex that you could not necessarily exactly reproduce or understand how a very complicated protein or a molecule, or if you even think of cell therapies, is composed. So you had to make reference to the process in which this article was produced in order to understand the quality, safety, and to some extent the effectiveness, or at least the consistency in the manufacturing process. So now, having those challenges, you may ask the question, well, how does FDA do all of this? And since there are so many different commodities that FDA is regulating, how is this actually done? This slide makes reference to the principal organizational structure of the Food and Drug Administration, led by the Office of the Commissioner for Food and Drug. So we have the Office of Regulatory Affairs, we have a Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research, Center for Devices and Radiological Health, Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. We have a National Center for Toxicological Research. We have a Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition. And we have a Center for Veterinary Medicine. Last not least, the youngest center is the Center for Tobacco Products. Let me not go into all regulation of all products today in this particular presentation, but let me specifically talk about medical products. The medical product regulatory life cycle is depicted in this slide here in a, let's say, linear process, and I make reference to this overview by pointing you into the different sections or general sections that can be divided into preclinical and discovery section, the clinical development part where phase 1, phase 2 and phase 3 clinical studies are conducted, and if a product is successful it will get approval, and then there is a post-approval period that can extend essentially as long as the product is on the market, because as you can imagine we want to make sure that the product continues to be safe and effective. So this is a summary, if you go through the slide, to point you to what some of the critical activities where sponsors or other stakeholders interact with FDA in order to prepare a new product for the market and obtain approval from the Food and Drug Administration. But there are somewhat different ways also how to look at it, and I personally prefer actually the somewhat circular model of the review process, which is illustrated here in this slide. Again, the first state here being the discovery and development process and the preclinical development, then moving into clinical development with clinical trials, phases 1, 2 and 3, and then into the approval with number 3 on it, And then number 4 illustrates the post-market surveillance, compliance, and control phase. Sometimes there are phase 4 clinical studies as depicted here. Now, you all know there are ways to change or alter some of the general steps that are taken. Particularly in the recent years, FDA has made significant efforts to bring products to the market faster to patients who need it, particularly in areas where there is no good treatment available. And as such, some new pathways were created, such as fast track, accelerated approval, expedited review, parallel track, and treatment INDs. Now, we also know that the patient actually is in the center of the attention. And here in this slide, I've tried to capture that by illustrating some of the critical roles that patients play in the whole product development process, and certainly also in the context of approval and regulation that FDA is dealing with. Patients are critical in giving feedback and providing information that leads to either redesign or reinvention or invention of new drug. Sometimes we refer to the process of reverse engineering, but we also would like the patients to be involved as co-investigators or almost as colleagues, because there's critical information that we only can obtain from patients. So with all the new technologies and tools and drug development tools that are in development, I want to point out that the patient population and the consumer in a different context plays a critical role for better performance and better outcome of products that FDA is regulating. So here is a list of medical product related activities that FDA is involved in. As such, new product review and pre-market approval. There's a proactive interaction during the review process. We provide written reviews for preclinical, clinical, and manufacturing data in response to the information that is submitted from the sponsors. And we think that in many cases, and in most cases, our decisions are transparent and consistent, because you can imagine Food and Drug Administration cannot make arbitrary or capricious decisions, and we have to be consistent. And with some of the products, that's quite challenging, particularly if you have product groups that are very distinct in the way that they either affect patients or in the way that they are manufactured. So we also engage in monitoring activities. We monitor the manufacturing processes in terms of quality and safety, and we have to make sure that anything that happens from the manufacturing facility to on the way of a product to its consumer or patient, everything is safe, it's handled safe and secure. FDA also has to very acutely be aware of any adverse events, any risk factors, or any changes in the population that would affect the outcome with any of the products that are used and or regulated by FDA. We have to make sure we communicate very clearly to patients and providers, specifically healthcare providers. We have to make sure that we can not only understand the products and the challenges, but we also have to make sure that we can actually enforce the law, and we can trigger compliance with any of the stakeholders. So many of the research activities at FDA actually target the underpinning information that improves safety, efficacy, and quality of products. What are important elements of activities that occur prior to the approval of a new product? Well, FDA, as you know, reviews applications and reviews data to determine if a product is safe and effective. We have to make sure that the benefits outweigh the risks. We evaluate whether studies and data submitted are adequate and well controlled and show that the product is safe and effective for the proposed use, and that it is appropriate also for the population. There certainly are challenges with that because we have minorities, we have populations like pediatric patients that are a special subgroup, and for that we have to take particular considerations into the context of how we regulate those products. FDA also determines to what extent we agree in the review process with the sponsors or the organization that submits a product for review, and whether we come to the same conclusion and whether there is additional information needed. That's often done in a structured dialogue. For generic drugs, for example, we require specific data that is mainly focused on the drug quality and the bioequivalence, and that is a distinction that can be challenging because we do not obtain clinical efficacy data with generic drugs. And if you think of the market, currently approximately 82% of all medical products are generic products. You can imagine how challenging this is for an agency if you don't see clinical data on those products. So in the device world, when devices or test kits are submitted for approval, sometimes we can make reference to pre-existing technologies and pre-existing methods and devices, and we use this, we call this the 510(k) pathway. It may allow approval that is based on a substantial similarity to previously cleared devices, and as such clinical data may not be required for this submission. For novel products, an advisory committee is typically convened to consider data, including presentations by both FDA and the sponsor. And often there is a vote on questions including efficacy and safety for the intended use. However, you have to also recognize that FDA is not bound to take the advisory committee recommendations into consideration for the approval process. Approaches to speed product review, access and approval to meet unmet medical needs for serious conditions. I mentioned to you some of the accelerated approval processes such as fast track designation, priority reviews, accelerated approval, which can be used likely in the context when surrogate markers are available and convincing as endpoints in clinical studies. We can give special approval pathways to breakthrough discoveries. We give it a breakthrough designation if it targets a market or a patient population that had no access to treatment before, particularly if there's very promising initial data. And there is availability under special access programs to accelerated approval, such as experimental INDs, treatment INDs, and compassionate use. But we also have special approval pathways for emergency medical countermeasures during public health emergencies, for example. So this slide lists the standard elements that FDA takes into consideration for approval processes and for the approval of new products. Safety is key. Purity, potency, stability, and compliance with good manufacturing processes are key to success when products are approved by the Food and Drug Administration. Now, with the approval, the responsibilities of the FDA have not ended. You remember from my circular slide that FDA continues to take responsibility for the products that it regulates when they are on the market. So what do we do post-approval? Well, we record and monitor rare adverse events, such things that are not detected during the clinical development and during the time when a product is submitted for review. We also conduct post-marketing studies such as phase 4 trials, which are sometimes required to address special populations with particular safety concerns or where there are specific safety signals in subpopulations. We do review adverse events that are reported through different systems, for example, MedWatcher, FAERS, and VAERS targeting medical drugs, products and vaccines, for example. One of the challenges that we have is that with those reporting systems, because they are driven by medical professionals, we often experience an underreporting. And the complexity of determining the etiology in a clinical setting, as well as the lack of ideal control data, is definitely a challenge in order to understand and assess such data. We do increase the use of active monitoring for adverse events. We include healthcare providers such as Medicare, Medicaid, and other surveillance systems such as PRISM and Sentinel. Findings of concerns made public and are communicated through different routes of communications. Sometimes advisory committees are involved, and results of such investigations and assessment lead to changes in labeling or warning letters, or even withdrawal of products from the market. As you can imagine, manufacturing quality oversight is critical to have products that are reliable, and as such FDA spends significant efforts in this area. We also deal with challenges like shortage and monitoring of supply, and we certainly, as you remember from some of my prior statements, deal with the challenge of counterfeit detection. And as you all experience from watching the media, advertising and promotional activities for particular medical products is something that FDA does regulate and control to prevent misstatements, misleading information, and protect the public from such. In this slide, I have outlined some of the emerging challenges, but challenges, as you know, often are also opportunities. So certainly bioterrorism, pandemics, emerging infections, new pathogens, complex global supply chains for food, drugs, and source materials. Antimicrobial resistance certainly is a great challenge. Emerging chemical concerns such as toxins or chemicals that may disrupt physiologic functions in human or other animal certainly are of concern, and as such FDA works with other agencies in order to address such issues. We talked about counterfeit products and subpotent drugs. Those are challenges for the agency. New technologies as they lead to development of products such as gene and cell therapies are challenges to the agency, where certainly science needs to inform our regulatory process. And then if we talk about patients as the center of the attention, precision medicine, also called in the past personalized medicine, certainly plays a very big role. We all are aware of the fact that as soon as we can detect and measure more information, we tend to accumulate more data. And dealing with big data for the agency is one of the challenges that we have to address in collaboration with other stakeholders. We also deal with novel materials. We deal with nanotechnology. We deal with 3D printing. And we deal with challenges including the interface between machine and human, sometimes also called electroceuticals. The supply chain of food and the engineered food that is derived from other organisms and or in vitro food supplies are critically evaluated by FDA. And yet another challenge, synthetic biology. So you can imagine FDA cannot tackle all that just with 15,000 employees, which is currently what FDA has on staff. So we truly rely on interactions and collaborations within the, if you want to call it, ecosystem. This slide just is an illustration how FDA interacts with other stakeholders and partners. And in my personal life, I have played some roles in perhaps all of the elements that are listed in the illustration here. I spent time in clinic as a physician. I worked in academia to do specific research, particularly targeted to infectious diseases. I have spent time in small businesses and larger pharmaceutical companies. So if you think about the central position that the regulatory agency takes in the context of a ecosystem of partnerships, it is also quite interesting to recognize that the Food and Drug Administration regulates about 25% of every consumer dollar spent in the US. So it is critical that this interaction and interaction with other stakeholders is facilitated through streamlined collaborations and very good collaborative processes. The best path forward in order to make sure that products are developed in a meaningful and effective way is probably to engage into a dialogue with the agency in a relatively early state of the product development. Early interaction can aid in identifying safety and other regulatory issues early, and it also can help to make the regulatory process more predictable. So advancing regulatory science and coordinating with other agencies, other stakeholders in such things like coordinated frameworks for regulation are essential in addressing challenges from emerging sciences, technologies, and challenges that we have with the regulation of new products. Why do we need regulatory science? Some of the answers to this question are obvious. If you think about it in an economic context, major investment and advances in basic science are not effectively translating into products that benefit patients. Product development is increasingly costly. New technologies and manufacturing sciences sometimes are a problem in terms of how we regulate it. We need better development and evaluation tools, and the tools that we are using right now in some of the cases have not kept up pace and do not incorporate emerging technologies. So it's really about the health of the nation and how the commodities that are regulated within the agency fuel the economic environment in which we are living. So FDA does take some responsibility in facilitating innovation. Some of the critical elements have been described and certainly are published. One of the references I'm making here is the National Blueprint on Bioeconomy, as well as the PCAS report, which delineates some of the challenges and offers some solutions to some of the problems. So FDA scientists in this process play a critical role because they're in a position where they see actually where the rubber hits the road. Through going through documentation and information submitted by sponsors that sometimes are in a competitive space of products that are relatively similar and yet have very similar problems and challenges, FDA scientists and reviewers get exposed to critical questions that are not addressed easily from academicians or even from industry because it's not as evident. So I think there's a lot of opportunity to interact with FDA scientists and facilitate good collaborations in order to address such common challenges, particularly if we are able to put it in a pre-competitive space and make the outcomes of such research available to all. The research that is done and in context with FDA is typically a little bit different than what is done with the National Institutes of Health or other basic research organizations, in that it is very specific to the product, and it is also different from the research that is done within a specific company because it often focuses on a particular product in a particular time frame. So we believe that we have to offer a lot of information that is not necessarily accessible by other means, and we encourage all the other stakeholders to work with FDA scientists. Now, what is regulatory science? I think this has been addressed in some of the other lectures that you probably have access to. And here is a relatively short definition of what it is, at least in the mind of FDAers. It is the science of developing new tools, standards, and approaches to assess safety, efficacy, quality, and performance of products. But it's also clear that science has always uncertainty, and it is a somewhat iterative process that requires the interaction of all stakeholders. Now, you can look at it, regulatory science, a little bit in an expanded way, and can say that regulatory science is a critical bridge between basic science and research discoveries that goes into the whole process of developing a new product. Certainly, regulatory science should be evidence-based, and it should be the foundation upon which regulations are crafted and put into practice. FDA has a strategic plan to advance regulatory science. It identifies opportunities in areas that are essential for the success of FDA. It is important to develop the tools that are appropriate to regulate the 21st century's products. With that, we promote innovation through targeted and collaborative approaches. And certainly, FDA builds in collaboration scientific capacity, infrastructure, culture, and collaborations, including through scientific and professional development of FDA scientists. And on the occasion, of course, that we are talking about the Centers of Excellence in Regulatory Science, I think those in the future will play a significant role to leverage the capacity and experience and professionalism that is, for example, in our academic institutions. So here's a list of the major strategic priority areas that FDA has identified. Number one is transform toxicology to enhance safety. Number two, stimulate innovation in clinical trials and precision medicine. Number three, support new approaches to improve product manufacturing and quality. Number four, ensure readiness to evaluate innovative and emerging technologies, build preparedness. Number five, harness diverse data through information sciences to improve health outcomes. Number six, implement new prevention-focused food safety systems to protect public health. Number seven, facilitate development of medical countermeasure products to protect the US and the global health and security. Number eight, strengthen social and behavioral science to help consumers and professionals make informed decisions. And number nine, develop a global product safety and surveillance network. So there are numerous examples where regulatory science has led us to relative success. Some of them are listed here on this slide, and you can certainly find references when you search the FDA website and look under the particular bullet points that I've listed here. Because in the interest of time, I make not specific reference to any of them, but give that to you as background information. Now, I told you that there has to be an administrative structure in order to organize research, and with the end goal, of course, to regulate product in a more effective way. And I also exposed you to the basic organizational structure, which again I list here with the 8 different centers under the Office of the Commissioner. But there are certainly challenges within the agency, because if you look at the actual report chart, how the different organizations are structured and tied together, it's not all that simple and straightforward. So what I want to point out here is this, that the processes and the interactions, even within FDA, are often challenging. And as such, the Office of the Commissioner has formed an Office of a Chief Scientist to facilitate the advancement and interactions of research and science activities between the different entities within FDA, but also with outside stakeholders and collaborators. So what are the Office of the Commissioner's key activities? Develop and articulate FDA's overarching strategic directions, manage external and legislative relationships and outreach, represent FDA to other agencies and departments, manage the directorates which are formed around the different product centers, coordinate the entities for medical products, foods, operations, global operations, inspections, and international activities. Support key cross-cutting infrastructure, such as facilities, human resources, information technology, and operations. And support activities like the Office of Special Medical Programs, or for combination products and orphan products, or products for pediatrics. Support the activities of advisory committees. The Office of the Chief Scientist also fosters the coordination, consistency, efficacy across programs and program areas in the area of policy with the Office of Policy, and law with the Office of the Chief Counsel. And certainly within the Office of the Commissioner, there is this critical office of the Office of the Chief Scientist that ties all those critical elements together. The Office of the Chief Scientist addresses issues and disputes that rise up above the center level. So here are some examples, like the Office of Orphan Products that was essentially established in 1983. We have right now over 250 orphan products on the market approved. And even though it's not the mainstream, but it is a very important activity that only can be coordinated across the agency from one of the central offices. Another example of the responsibilities of the Office of the Chief Scientist and the Office of the Commissioner are the coordination and interaction with advisory committees and management staff. It is to protect and enhance quality and integrity of the regulatory decision-making. It is to obtain outside and independent and diverse expert advice and recommendations. It is also to allow for open public discussions of important issues. Currently, FDA has 33 advisory committees. About 18 of those are specific to medical devices. And on average, or approximately about between 80 and 90 advisory committee meetings are held every year. There are about 620 different members in those consortia and advisory groups, including academia, clinicians, people from industry, and certainly patients and consumers. Those advisory committees provide the opportunity for public input as well, because we want to reflect the opinion and certainly the feedback that we get from our patients and consumers. So here are some examples that are of things that are brought to the discussion with advisory committees. We have advisory committees in context of product approvals. We form discussions with advisory committees around major adverse events, as well as reporting and labeling issues. Sometimes there are manufacturing and quality issues. Risk communication and management are subject of discussion with advisory committees. And advisory committees also do review major agency initiatives and activities to evaluate if those are done effectively and determine if there is cross-cutting scientific fertilization. But there are some other ways that FDA gets input, such as formal input from the public through comments on proposed rules. And as you may know, FDA posts such things in the Federal Register, and it's often a summary of the regulatory requirements to ensure compliance with food and drug law, and the ultimate would lead to means to have legal enforceability. There are public comment opportunities on draft FDA guidances. There are also individual advisors and consultants, and we have informal scientific meetings, such as workshops. Many of those workshops are held in co-sponsorship, and FDA is participating as a discussant. One of the critical elements that you want to recognize is that all of those meetings that has FDA as a participant, that information has to be public information unless it's very specific to a product. If it's very specific to a product, then it's part of the product development pipeline and certainly protects the intellectual property of the sponsor. But any other discussion that is held in terms of the solution to problems is public information, because we want to make sure that it's accessible to all. Public-private partnerships are a very powerful means to engage in dialogue. Here are some of the examples that we have engaged into in the past few years. Again, this is a reference to you to perhaps look up FDA websites and get more information specifically on those public-private partnerships. Now, specifically the Office of the Chief Scientist, as I mentioned, plays a critical role. It's a focal point for FDA's regulatory science activities in promoting research, collaborations within and outside FDA, integrity and excellence of the FDA scientific enterprise, and a robust public health preparedness and response. There are several offices within the Office of the Chief Scientist. I work in the Office of Regulatory Science and Innovation, we call ORSI. I work very closely with the colleagues in the Office of Countermeasures and Emerging Threats, the colleagues in the Office of Scientific Professional Development, the Office of Scientific Integrity, the Office of Women's Health, the Office of Minority Health, and the Center for Toxicology Research, the National Center for Toxicology Research, which is actually located in Arkansas. Now, FDA scientists represent a relatively broad spectrum of the sciences, which you can imagine are necessary to conduct and fulfill FDA's mission. This is just a quick glance at the distribution of the scientific specialization that scientists have at FDA. There are different activities that administrative and scientific staff engages into, such as clinical activities, product quality, engineering questions, pharmaceutical and toxicological questions, biometrics, project management, and as such, the list can be expanded, but that just gives you some examples here of different specializations and subgroups of researchers and experts that we have at the Food and Drug Administration. I would like to make specific reference to some of the programs and perhaps also refer to my colleagues in the future to make presentations about the special programs that deal with advancing regulatory science and questions around the critical path initiative. And here is just a short summary of that. Currently we are engaged in about 60 or over 60 regulatory science and critical path initiative projects. This again is in collaboration with all the regulating centers, CBER, CDER, NCTR, CVM, CDRH and CIFSAN. FDA collaborates with more than 30 organizations in the context of regulatory science and critical path initiative projects. And from the Office of the Chief Scientist and the Office of Regulatory Science and Innovation, we support research programs and science in several areas. And as such, we have developed programs to facilitate that. For example, we do support intramural research grants within the agency to stimulate innovation and high priority area to research. We also provide an FDA-wide science and research core infrastructure support in terms of specifically organizing it. One of the key elements that is supported by the Office of the Chief Scientist are scientific subject matter expert working group, which form the basis to provide advice to decision-making processes. We have a program around the Centers of Excellence in Regulatory Science. We have a Technology Transfer and Strategic Partnerships group, and we have a contracting mechanism termed the Broad Agency Announcement, which allows us to very nimbly engage into research contracts targeting essentially several needs. One is from a grassroots perspective, emerging needs that are developing within the agency can be relatively nimble addressed in this contracting mechanism. But it's also the opportunity for the agency to do horizon scanning towards solutions that other outside entities would offer to the agency in order to address some of the problems. How do we prioritize research within the agency? Well, there are several levels of prioritization, and certainly there is a coordinated process between the regulating centers and the central offices. At the center level, there are regulatory science steering committees and subcommittees to evaluate priorities and form consensus. And agency-wide, FDA-wide, we have as I mentioned already, a system of subject matter expert scientific working groups and councils. We have steering committees, such as the Steering Committee for the Centers of Excellence in Regulatory Science, to evaluate priorities and set the resources for priorities appropriately. These decisions are communicated and vetted with the Senior Science Council, which has representation from all the centers. And the Senior Science Council informs the executive leadership team, including and inclusive of the center directors and the Commissioner of FDA. Now, as I mentioned, I'm working for the Office of Regulatory Science and Innovation within the Office of the Chief Scientist. And as such, I have brought some schematic overview about the different programs that the Office of Regulatory Science and Innovation is facilitating. And you find this on this slide illustrated as bubbles. There are probably better ways to do it, but at least it gives you some of the key information. So we have the program for the Centers of Excellence in Regulatory Science. We support the Broad Agency Announcement contracting mechanism. We have a group that deals specifically with technology transfer and strategic partnerships. We support the scientific expert working groups across the agency. We have a program for intramural grants. And those programs form the basis for critical collaborations within the agency, interactions within the agency, but also to interact with other agencies and to link the agency into a network of the stakeholders. Now, opportunity is also in complexity. One of the things that I hope you did understand from following through some of my elaborations and the information that I've provided you is to understand that successful drug and product regulation requires a multitude of things, and FDA has to perform at a very high level in several disciplines, which include science, law, medicine, policy, but there are also questions of managerial and executional excellence. And certainly we have to do what we need to do in order to create political and stakeholder engagements. With that, I would again like to point out that partnership and collaboration is critical. Today's challenges are way too complex for any one party or sector to solve it. Urgent public health situations have required robust public-private partnering, either formal or informal, to be successful. Such challenges provide models for innovation in partnering and for a culture change, both inside and outside the government. FDA is always actively engaging and certainly welcomes more ideas and models. In summary, the modern food and drug law, which keeps us safe, has arisen primarily in the past on responses to tragedies. FDA's product-specific review and surveillance occurs primarily through its product centers and continues through the product lifecycle. The Office of the Commissioner provides cross-cutting coordination, strategic leadership, and support in conjunction with the Office of the Chief Scientist, and serves as an advocate and enabler for scientists and scientific enterprise and for public health preparedness. Globalization and emerging technologies provide both opportunities and challenges. Regulatory science is critical to provide tools needed to enhance our biomedical enterprise, economy, speeding products to patients, safety, and addressing new technologies and challenges. The work is too complex for just one party or sector. New collaborative models, both inside and outside the government, are essential for success. With that, I would like to thank you.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.